When we work with planning models, allocation is one of the methods we can use to complete our planning tasks. In this example, we have a table that shows operating income and gross profit values for all product groups, but with all operating expenses unassigned. We want to use allocation to distribute the personnel costs to the different product groups. Note that unlike spreading, distribution, and assignment, which can be performed directly within stories and are covered in separate videos, allocations are processes that we need to define outside of stories. Also note that to support allocation, dimensions in the models other than account, time, and version must have an unassigned member with a hashtag symbol in the ID column. This member is generated automatically in each dimension when we create a blank model, and is where the values go by default before we allocate them to other dimension members. First, we need to create a new allocation process. We'll enter a process name and then specify the underlying model. Each allocation process comprises one or more steps. We can create new steps or load steps that have been created for previous allocation processes. Here, we'll create a new step. First, we'll enter an allocation step name, and optionally, we can enter a description. Next, we need to select the source and target dimensions for allocation. For this example, we'll be taking values from the account dimension and allocating them to the product group dimension. Note that it's also possible to use the same dimension as both the source and target. When we do this, we can specify a number of repetitions if desired. Repetition of a step is useful in cases where the allocation must be run several times to assign all the desired values to the target, such as when using the reciprocal allocation method. We have the option to add one or more additional source dimensions, which would be used as overwrite dimensions. If we were to use region as an overwrite dimension, for example, this would allow us to create more complex rules that allocate account values to different product groups for different regions. For this example, we won't use an overwrite dimension. We also have the option to add additional target dimensions. This would enable us to create rules that allocate values to multiple target dimensions using the same source dimension and driver. For this example, we'll use a single target. In the Show Options area, the Breakdown by Dimensions option allows us to specify one or more reference dimensions, which would be used for weighting the values assigned during allocation. For example, in this case, we're going to allocate values from the accounts to different products. If we chose to use region as a reference dimension, the account values would be allocated to products based on the amount of the account assigned to each region. The Filter by Accounts option allows us to specify a subset of accounts on which to perform the allocation. In this case, we want to allocate only the personnel cost accounts, so we could apply a filter to do this. However, since the account dimension is our source dimension, a filter is unnecessary in this case. Now we're ready to create our allocation step. Within our step, we can define one or more allocation rules. We'll create a rule to take the personnel costs from the account dimension and allocate them to the available product types. First, we'll choose to allocate only the personnel costs from the account dimension. Next, we need to choose a driver, which is a variable that determines how much of the value to allocate to each member of the target. For example, direct assignment would mean that the entire value for each personnel cost would go directly to a single member of the target dimension, such as tennis shoes. Note that direct assignment can be done only when the target is a leaf member. In this case, we want to use the target all products, which is not a leaf member, so direct assignment isn't possible. In this case, we'll use labor cost as the driver. This means that values will be allocated to each of the target products based on the cost of labor to produce each product. We'll complete our rule by setting all products as the target, so each product will be allocated some of the value. Now we're ready to save the allocation rule. Note that we could create additional rules within this allocation step, or additional steps in our allocation process if desired. Also note that when an allocation step does contain multiple rules, the more specific rules are executed first, followed by the more general ones, regardless of the order in which the rules are created. For example, if our first rule allocated values to all products and our second rule allocated values only to a single product, the second rule would be applied first. Now we'll return to our story to apply the allocation process. Note that all personnel cost values are currently unassigned. Now we'll execute our allocation process. We need to specify the process to apply, as well as the version on which to apply the allocation. In this case, the default selections are correct. On the Confirm Scope of Allocation screen, we can choose whether to restrict the members on which to perform the allocation. The Use Point of View option means that the items currently filtered from the table will be excluded from the allocation. The Refine Filters option allows us to apply additional filters to restrict the allocation, such as adding a time-based filter. Note that dimensions that are part of the model but not shown in the table can be affected by allocation unless we explicitly apply filters to exclude them. The No Filters option allows us to apply the allocation even to those members that are currently excluded by filters. Here, we'll use the Point of View filter. The allocation has now been executed. Note that the unassigned column now displays no values for personnel costs, and the values have been assigned to apparel and footwear. The amount of the total value assigned to each product was determined by the relative labor cost to produce each product. Thanks for watching.